Hollywood thought this funeral would be quiet. No headlines, no controversy, just a respectful goodbye to Rob Reiner. But inside that small chapel, silence didn't mean peace. Because when Billy Crystal stood up, he didn't deliver a tribute. He hesitated. And that hesitation said more than words ever could. Why did he pause? Why did he admit he misunderstood Rob's final days, and what fear did Rob carry for years? One that only came to light after his death. This wasn't just a farewell. It was a confession. And once it was spoken, there was no way to unhear it. The day Hollywood learned that Rob Reiner had passed away, the reaction wasn't loud or dramatic. It felt like the entire industry hesitated, as if time itself slowed down for a moment. This was the man behind some of the warmest and most enduring stories ever put on an American screen, and yet his departure came without spectacle, without noise, leaving behind a kind of absence that no one could immediately explain. Even the people closest to him struggled to find the right words for what they had lost. His funeral reflected that same quiet weight. It took place inside a small Brentwood chapel far from cameras and public attention, sealed off from the outside world. There were no polished speeches prepared for applause, no media presence chasing grief, just white flowers lining the room, candles flickering softly, and the people who truly mattered in Rob Reiner's life standing close together. The space felt tight, guarded, almost deliberate in its stillness, as if the room itself demanded restraint. Everyone assumed the ceremony would pass in silence, that it would end the way it began, quietly. But then Billy Crystal slowly stood up. He didn't rush toward the podium. He didn't speak right away. He stood there with his head lowered, motionless, as if he were wrestling with something heavy inside before deciding whether he should mention anything at all. When he finally began to speak, his voice was low and fragile, breaking, as he admitted that he had been the person Rob chose to confide in during his final days, and that he hadn't fully understood how desperate Rob truly was. In that instant, the room locked up. This was no longer a standard goodbye. This was a confession, raw and unguarded, arriving too late. The weight of it settled into the silence, forcing everyone present to confront the idea that Rob Reiner had been carrying his struggle quietly, with signs slipping past even the people who loved him most. And now that truth had nowhere left to go. The room tightened the moment Billy Crystal paused, as if the silence itself had weight. This wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from politeness or respect. It was the kind that presses inward, leaving no space to escape. The chapel was small and deliberately closed off, meant only for those who truly knew Rob Reiner, and in that confined space, every detail felt sharper. Yellow candlelight spilled softly across the dark wooden walls, not warm enough to comfort, just enough to remind everyone why they were there. White flowers traced the aisle, their faint scent hanging stubbornly in the air, impossible to ignore. The pews sat too close together, forcing people to remain still, shoulders squared, eyes forward, as if even a small movement would feel out of place. No one turned to whisper. No one leaned toward another. Breathing was careful, controlled. In that room, there was nowhere left to hide. When the back door opened earlier and Billy had stepped inside, he hadn't looked around or taken anything in. He had walked straight ahead, eyes fixed forward, as though one glance to the side might break something he was struggling to hold together. The only thing grounding him had been the simple bouquet of white flowers in his hands, held tightly, then loosened, then tightened again. Tucked among the stems was a small card, its edges wrinkled and creased from being folded and unfolded too many times, carrying words that hadn't yet been read. Each step he took toward the front felt slow and heavy, his shoulders sagging slightly, whether from age or from something deeper weighing him down. When he finally reached Rob's portrait, He stopped and stood there longer than expected, frozen between stepping closer and turning away, between acceptance and denial. His eyes stayed locked on the photograph, not like a man politely paying respects, but like someone who had just lost the last thing keeping him steady. Only after that long pause did he place the flowers at the base of the frame, gently adjust the card, and turn toward the podium. Now standing there with the microphone in his hand and no notes to shield him, the silence returned thicker than before. Billy didn't rush to fill it. He stood unmoving for several seconds, as if bracing himself for words that could no longer be avoided, and in that moment it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer just a funeral. It was a reckoning unfolding in real time with nothing prepared to soften what was about to come next. When Billy Crystal finally lifted the microphone, his voice came out low and unsteady, not forced, not theatrical, but fragile in a way that immediately changed the room. He said he hated having to stand there, because if he was speaking, it meant Rob Reiner was truly gone. The words landed without flourish, without preparation, and the silence tightened again as everyone realized this was not going to be a polished tribute. Billy admitted that during Rob's final days, he had been the person Rob chose to confide in, the one he trusted enough to speak honestly with. And then came the sentence no one expected to hear at a funeral. Billy said he hadn't fully understood how desperate Rob truly was. The air seemed to lock in place. This was no longer remembrance. It was confession. The kind that arrives too late and leaves nowhere to put the weight it carries. Billy wasn't accusing himself, and he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was stating a truth that now had to exist in the open, that Rob Reiner had been carrying something heavy in silence, and that the signs had slipped past even the people who loved him most. As Billy spoke, it became clear that this wasn't a story meant for the room at all. It was something he had never planned to say out loud, something pulled from a private place where regret had already taken hold. The room didn't respond with murmurs or movement. No one shifted in their seat. No one looked away. Everyone understood instinctively that once those words had been spoken, the funeral had crossed a line it could not step back from. What had begun as a quiet farewell was now something else entirely, a moment where the past could no longer be softened, and the weight of what had been missed settled permanently into the silence. As Billy Crystal continued, the room slowly shifted from shock into something quieter and more intimate, because he wasn't talking about awards, box office success, or the public version of Rob Reiner that everyone recognized. He spoke about the man few people ever saw. Rob, he explained, was never a loud presence. He didn't walk into rooms trying to dominate them or pull attention toward himself. He simply existed in a way that made people feel grounded, safe, and seen. According to Billy, Rob had a rhythm to his life that almost never changed, small habits that reflected who he was at his core. He called at exactly the right time, never early, never late. If an appointment was set for 8 o'clock, the phone would ring precisely on the hour. And after every show, Billy did every appearance that mattered to him. Would always reach out with a short message, never dramatic, never layered with explanations, just enough to let Billy know he had been watching and that he was still there. What stayed with Billy most was the one question Rob always asked, the same one every time. "Are you okay?" It was never casual and never rushed. Rob waited for the answer. If Billy stayed silent, Rob didn't fill the space. If the answer wasn't good, Rob didn't offer speeches or solutions. Billy explained that throughout his life there had never been a shortage of people eager to pull him out of sadness or push him forward, but Rob was different. He didn't try to erase pain or hurry it along. He stayed. He sat beside Billy long enough for him to breathe again, on his own terms, in his own time. As Billy spoke, his voice tightened slightly, his grip on the microphone shifting, and it became clear this wasn't a rehearsed memory or a polished story. It was a truth about a friendship built not on noise or advice, but on patience, presence, and the rare ability to sit with someone in silence without trying to change what they were feeling. As the memory settled, Billy Crystal lowered his head slightly, and his voice grew quieter, slower, as if he were stepping into something he had been trying to avoid. He said there was still one message from Rob Reiner, just a short one sitting unanswered. He had read it and told himself he would reply later. There was also an appointment still on the calendar, nothing dramatic, just a simple meal they had planned for the following week. The kind of ordinary moment people assume will always be there. And there was one sentence Billy had meant to say, something uncomplicated and familiar, but he kept pushing it aside, convinced there would be another chance. As he spoke, he didn't look at anyone in the room. His eyes fixed on the empty space ahead, as if Rob were standing there listening. Billy said quietly that he thought they still had time, that he let later take it away. The words didn't rise or fall. They didn't reach for sympathy. They simply landed and stayed there, heavy and undeniable. When he finished, Billy closed his eyes for several long seconds, as if holding his voice together took everything he had left. The room remained completely still, not because anyone demanded silence, but because no one knew how to move past that moment. It wasn't just about a missed reply or a delayed conversation anymore. It was the realization that time had been assumed, not promised, and that once it was gone, no explanation or intention could bring it back. After the weight of that realization settled, Billy Crystal remained standing, refusing to rush what came next, as if he were still deciding whether the truth he was holding even belonged in that room. When he finally lifted his eyes, his voice returned lower than before, slower, carrying a different kind of gravity. He said there was one thing Rob Reiner had shared with him in private, something never meant for public ears, but something that now mattered if people were to understand who Rob truly was. Billy explained that Rob was not someone who complained or turned personal struggles into a burden. If he could endure something quietly, he always chose silence. But there were late nights when Rob would call not to vent and not to ask for answers, sometimes saying very little at all, just staying on the line long enough to know he wasn't alone. During those calls, after long stretches of silence, Rob would begin asking questions that had nothing to do with movies or Hollywood, questions about fatherhood, about watching a child grow and change, and about the fear of not knowing how to hold on without pushing them further away. One night, Rob asked Billy what a father was supposed to do when he felt his child slowly slipping out of reach, and in that moment, Billy understood Rob was talking about his son. For years, Rob had been watching his child struggle with addiction, a long and exhausting battle marked by hope that never fully held. Rehab after rehab had come and gone, enough attempts that numbers stopped meaning anything to Rob, because what mattered wasn't success or failure, but the helplessness of knowing he couldn't take the suffering away. Billy didn't dwell on details because none were needed. Rob's pain wasn't rooted in anger or disappointment. It came from fear, the quiet kind, the kind that asks what might have been missed, what might have been said too late, and whether love alone was enough to protect a child who was fighting something far beyond control. As Billy Crystal continued, his words slowed further, careful and restrained, because what he was about to describe was something Rob Reiner had never framed as a warning, and never allowed himself to say out loud more than once. Billy explained that during one of those late conversations, Rob admitted a fear that slipped out almost by accident, a thought he immediately tried to pull back as if it didn't belong anywhere outside his own mind. Rob said there were moments when he worried his son was no longer fully in control of himself, moments when addiction could take over so completely that reason disappeared and actions stretched beyond what anyone could stop. It wasn't a fear rooted in anger or distrust, but in the possibility that in that state his son might not even recognize who was standing in front of him. Billy said Rob ended the conversation right there, refusing to go any deeper, as if naming the fear too clearly might make it real. But with time and distance, Billy came to understand why that thought never left Rob alone. It wasn't because Rob believed something terrible would happen, but because it was the deepest fear a father could carry, the realization that love by itself might not always be enough to protect either yourself or the child you love most. What made it heavier was knowing Rob carried that fear entirely on his own. He never turned it into accusation, never used it as a reason to pull away, never stopped showing up. He kept calling. He kept waiting. He kept believing that as long as he stayed present, his child would never be completely lost, even when the uncertainty grew louder than hope. After admitting that fear, Billy Crystal explained, there was another weight. Rob Reiner struggled to name one that kept him awake through countless nights. It wasn't greed and it wasn't mistrust. It was responsibility. Rob worried about money, about inheritance, about what would happen when he was no longer there to protect his son from the timing of it all. He feared that leaving everything too quickly or without the right preparation could turn into another burden, instead of a lifeline pushing his son deeper into a spiral he was already fighting to escape. Rob never spoke about it as doubt or hesitation. He framed it as a father's duty, the painful kind that sometimes requires restraint instead of generosity. He loved his son deeply, but that love came tied to the fear that what he left behind could do harm if it arrived at the wrong moment. As Billy shared this, he admitted a thought had begun looping in his own mind, one he hadn't wanted to face, the possibility that the crushing mix of pressure, expectations, money, and addiction might have pushed Rob into a constant state of anxiety with no clear exit. And then Billy repeated the sentence Rob had once said quietly, almost casually, the one that stayed with him long after. Rob had told him that he could direct everything on a film set, but he couldn't direct his son's life. It wasn't said with dramatic regret or self-blame. It was said like a man replaying moments in his head, wondering which ones mattered most, knowing that some things, no matter how badly you want another take, can never be rewritten. When Billy Crystal reached the end of what he had to say, there was no release, no signal for the room to respond. He didn't look up for approval or pause for effect. He simply let the words settle where they had landed. No one applauded. No one stood. The silence that followed wasn't instructed or expected. It happened because no one knew how to interrupt it without breaking something. Billy gently placed the microphone down, careful in the way someone is careful, when setting aside something fragile, and stepped away from the podium. His shoulders were slightly hunched as he walked back, whether from exhaustion or from having left too much of himself behind, no one could say. The ceremony didn't try to recover its rhythm after that. It didn't need to. In that moment, Rob Reiner was no longer being remembered as a director, a Hollywood figure, or a cultural icon. He was being seen as something far more raw and familiar. A man who spent his final years loving fiercely, worrying constantly, and carrying fears he never turned into blame. A father who stayed even when staying offered no guarantees. The chapel remained still as people absorbed that truth, understanding that this goodbye didn't belong to noise or performance. Rob Reiner's life closed the way it had often unfolded, quietly, without spectacle, surrounded only by those who truly walked beside him. What he left behind wasn't just a collection of films or unforgettable scenes, but a way of moving through life with patience, empathy, and presence. And as the room slowly emptied, one thing was clear. This story wasn't meant to end in sadness alone. It was meant to linger as a reminder of how easily time is assumed, how quietly fear can be carried, and how much of a life is defined not by what is said loudly, but by what is held silently until the very end. If Rob Reiner ever meant something to you, if one of his films ever stayed with you longer than you expected, this is the moment to acknowledge it. Leave a farewell in the comments and let that memory live on. And if you want more stories like this, stories about the people behind the names and the truths that only surface when it's almost too late, make sure to subscribe and stay with us.